What if I told you that some of the fastest cars of their time didn't look fast at all? Picture this. It's 1959. Cars are huge, covered in chrome, loaded with dramatic fins, built to impress, not to race. Or at least, that's what people believed. At first glance, none of these cars seem fast. They look made for smooth cruising, not quick acceleration. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. Watch the full video and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, here's where things get interesting. Beneath those bold, stylish exteriors, something very different was happening. Engines were getting bigger, power was increasing, and performance was quietly improving, often beyond what anyone expected from cars like these. That contrast is what makes this era so fascinating. Let's start with the 1959 Chevrolet Impala. This wasn't a car that screamed speed, but it played a key role in changing expectations. Imagine the late 50s, music in the background, a brand new Impala rolling out of the dealership, shiny, massive, and full of chrome. Those oversized rear fins seemed to matter more than anything else. People admired it for its style, its presence, and the way it dominated the road even when parked. Speed wasn't part of the conversation, but behind the scenes, Chevrolet was taking performance seriously. While the design became more extravagant, the engineering was evolving rapidly, and the Impala proves it. Under the hood sat a 348 V8 engine with a tri-power setup, 3 carburetors working together with one goal: more air, more fuel, more power. In this configuration, it produced around 315 horsepower, with even higher output in more extreme versions. For 1959, that was impressive. But the real story isn't just the number, it's the contrast. Nothing about this car prepares you for that kind of performance. It's not low, not lightweight, and not aggressive in appearance. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Yet when you pressed the accelerator, it responded faster than anyone expected. That's what made it special. This wasn't designed to be the fastest car on the road, but within its time, it ended up being one of them. It's also important to remember that 1959 was a turning point. Automakers were beginning to compete not only in design, but also in performance. Chevrolet recognized this shift early. The Impala wasn't just a beautiful car, it marked the beginning of a new era where cars could offer both style and speed. Looking at the numbers, it's clear. The Impala could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8 to 9 seconds. That might not sound impressive today, but back then, for a car of its size, it was more than enough to surprise people, and it did exactly that. Even today, its value reflects its significance. A well-maintained 1959 Chevrolet Impala with the 348 tri-power engine typically ranges between $40,000 and $90,000, with exceptional examples going even higher. It's not just a design icon, it's one of the cars that proved big cars could also be fast. Now let's talk about the 1959 Cadillac Series 62. This isn't the kind of car you'd expect to see in a race, but that doesn't mean it couldn't hold its own. In 1959, Cadillac operated in a league of its own. While other brands were starting to explore performance, Cadillac focused on size, luxury, and presence. This car didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. And because of that, few people stopped to consider what it was actually capable of. Under the hood, it featured a 390 V8 engine producing around 325 horsepower, another strong figure for the time. But again, context matters. This wasn't a lightweight car. It was one of the largest and heaviest vehicles on the road, yet it still delivered impressive performance. On open highways, the Series 62 could keep pace with much lighter cars, something that didn't align with its image at all. That's what makes it so interesting. It doesn't shock you with explosive acceleration. It surprises you simply by being capable of it. There's a reason for that. Cadillac didn't need to prove anything back then. It didn't compete on raw numbers. It competed on perception. Still, it made sure its cars were never slow. And that creates a unique contrast. The car doesn't look fast, but it doesn't behave like a slow one either. That gap between expectation and reality is where the real surprise lies. In terms of performance, the 0 to 60 miles per hour time was around 9 to 10 seconds, more than respectable for a car of that size back then. More importantly, it was quick enough to challenge what people expected from a car like this. That sense of surprise still carries over today. A 1959 Cadillac Series 62 typically falls between $35,000 and $80,000, with well-restored examples reaching even higher prices. It may not be the most extreme car of its era, but it perfectly represents the idea we're exploring. A car that was never meant to be fast, yet clearly refused to feel slow. Now let's move on to the 1959 Pontiac Bonneville. This one brought something different to the table, and it didn't try to hide it. While many cars of the time looked fast without actually delivering, the Bonneville was playing a more honest game. Pontiac was already building a reputation back then. It wasn't just about making cars that looked good, it wanted them to feel alive, and this model is one of the earliest signs of that philosophy. At first glance, it still has that bold 1959 styling, big, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. But there's something about it that stands out. It feels more purposeful, more expressive, like it was designed with performance in mind, not just appearance. That becomes clear when you look under the hood. The 389 V8 engine with a tri-power setup, 3 carburetors, was built for responsiveness rather than just smooth cruising. With around 315 horsepower, the numbers are strong, but what really matters is how that power feels. This isn't just a car that moves forward, it reacts. Press the throttle and you feel an immediate response, a direct connection between driver and machine. In 1959, especially for a car this large, that kind of responsiveness was rare. And that's the key point. The Bonneville begins to break the idea that big cars were only about comfort. There's a clear intention here to create something more dynamic, more engaging, something that hints at what Pontiac would become in the years to come. This wasn't sleuthy or accidental. It was the beginning of a shift. Performance-wise, it could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8 seconds, making it one of the quicker cars in its class at the time. That changes the story completely. This car doesn't just look more aggressive, it actually backs it up. Its value today reflects that significance. A 1959 Pontiac Bonneville with the tri-power setup typically ranges between $40,000 and $85,000, depending on its condition and originality. It's not just another stylish car from the late 50s. It's one of the first clear signs that something in the industry was evolving. Now I'm curious. Out of the cars we've talked about so far, which one surprises you more? The Impala, for how unexpected it is, or the Bonneville, for showing that more aggressive edge early on? Let me know in the comments. Next, let's talk about the 1959 DeSoto Fireflite. This is a car that rarely comes up in conversations like this, and that's exactly what makes it so interesting. When people think of fast cars from the late 50s, they usually mention Chevrolet, Pontiac, or Chrysler. DeSoto is often overlooked, but it shouldn't be. The Fireflite wasn't just another model. It was one of the brand's most ambitious efforts. Big, bold, and fully embracing that wild 1959 design language, it still managed to stand out with its own identity. From the dramatic rear fins to the heavily detailed front end, everything about it demanded attention. But what really matters isn't just how it looks, it's what's hidden underneath. Under the hood, it carried a 361 cubic inch V8, producing around 305 horsepower. Not the highest number on this list, but again, context matters. This car didn't have the same reputation or expectations as its competitors, and yet it performed with a level of confidence that didn't match how people perceived it. That's what makes it stand out. The Fireflite isn't impressive because it dominates the competition. It's impressive because it manages to belong in this conversation at all. There's another detail that adds to its story. 1959 was one of the final meaningful years for DeSoto as a brand. Not long after, it disappeared entirely. That gives this car a deeper significance. It's not just a capable performer, it's part of the brand's closing chapter. Looking back, it represents a moment that didn't last, a final attempt to stay relevant in a rapidly changing market. Performance-wise, it could reach 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 9 seconds, putting it surprisingly close to more well-known rivals. And that's the real twist. It shouldn't be that close, but it is. Its current value reflects that uniqueness. A 1959 DeSoto Fireflite typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, with well-preserved examples commanding even higher prices. Let's talk about the 1959 Ford Galaxie. This is one of those cars that actually looked fast, but not for the usual reasons. Unlike many cars from 1959, the Galaxie didn't rely on over-the-top styling or dramatic details to stand out. Its design was cleaner, more restrained, and less about putting on a show. Instead, it focused on being a well-rounded, complete car. That difference is noticeable right away. It doesn't come across like a flashy land yacht. It feels more serious, more purposeful. At the time, Ford was in a position where it had to compete not just in design, but in performance as well. And the Galaxie was part of that strategy. It wasn't about excess, it was about balance. You can see that in what it offered. The 352 V8 was already a strong starting point. But when you moved up to options like the 390 V8, the character of the car changed. It felt more responsive, more alert, more willing to perform. It didn't have the aggressive edge of a Pontiac or the smooth luxury feel of a Cadillac. Instead, it sat somewhere in between, more practical, more usable. And that's what makes it stand out here. The Galaxie doesn't rely on contrast to surprise you. It surprises you by simply delivering on what it promises, and then going a bit further. Everything about it suggests it should perform well, and it does. But what really caught people off guard was just how well it performed. Period tests showed that a properly equipped Galaxie could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8 seconds, putting it right alongside cars that were considered more performance-focused. That puts it in a unique position. It may not be the flashiest option, but it certainly doesn't fall behind. There's also a bigger picture here. Ford was quietly building a foundation that would later lead to more performance-oriented models. Cars like the Galaxie were an important step in that evolution. They weren't extreme, but they helped open the door. That legacy is still reflected in its value today. A 1959 Ford Galaxie in good condition typically ranges between $30,000 and $70,000, depending on the engine and overall condition. Now, let's move on to the 1959 Buick Invicta. At first glance, this might not seem like a car that belongs in this conversation, but it absolutely does, and more than most people expect. The Invicta occupied a very specific position in the market. It didn't have the spotlight of Cadillac, the aggressive personality of Pontiac, or the widespread recognition of Chevrolet. It sat somewhere in the middle, and because of that, it was often overlooked. But that's exactly where the surprise begins. Buick had a very distinct approach during this era. It wasn't chasing extreme performance numbers or trying to project a sporty image. Instead, it focused on balance. And that balance hides more capability than you might think. Under the hood, the 401 cubic inch V8 made a real difference. It wasn't just large, it was efficient for its size, and delivered a level of responsiveness that felt more lively than expected in a car like this. That became especially clear in situations where other cars started to struggle. The Invicta didn't demand attention, but when pushed, it responded confidently. And that's where the contrast lies. This isn't a car that surprises you with its looks. It surprises you because you don't expect much from it in the first place. There's also an important detail behind this. Buick focused heavily on refining the driving experience without sacrificing real capability. It didn't want cars that felt unpredictable or overly aggressive. It aimed for cars that performed consistently well in all conditions. The Invicta reflects that philosophy perfectly. It may not dominate in a single area, but when you look at the full package, it makes complete sense. Performance-wise, it could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8 to 9 seconds, placing it right in a competitive range for its class, quick enough to surprise without needing to overstate anything. That same balance shows up in its value today. A 1959 Buick Invicta typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on condition and originality. Now I'm curious, do you find this kind of balanced car more interesting? Or do you prefer cars that clearly show their performance intentions right from the start? Let me know in the comments. Finally, let's look at the 1959 Oldsmobile Super 88. This is a car that didn't need to prove itself. It already had a reputation. By the late 1950s, Oldsmobile had established itself as a brand that built cars which were not only comfortable, but genuinely capable. The Super 88 is a great example of that. At first glance, it fits right into the 1959 style. Large, chrome-heavy, and long in proportion. But there's something about it that feels a bit more controlled, less exaggerated, and more focused than many of its competitors. There's something about the design of this car that feels like it serves a deeper purpose, and that's not by accident. Oldsmobile was one of the early brands to take performance seriously in cars like this. Not in an extreme or flashy way, but in a consistent, well-thought-out manner. You can see that clearly in what it offers. Under the hood is a 394 V8, producing around 315 horsepower. But more important than the number itself is the idea behind it. This engine wasn't built for a single moment of excitement. It was designed to deliver reliable, usable performance every time you drove it. The Super 88 wasn't meant to impress just once. It was built to perform well all the time, and that's what makes it stand out here. While some cars surprise you with hidden performance, this one impresses with how well everything works together. There's no unnecessary drama, no over-the-top features, but also no real weaknesses. And for a car of this size, that kind of balance was rare. A detail that often gets overlooked is how important Oldsmobile was in shaping early American performance culture. Cars like the Super 88 helped establish a simple but important idea. A big car could still be capable. That's reflected in its performance. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 8 seconds, putting it right alongside some of the best cars in its class. It didn't demand attention, but it certainly didn't fall behind. Even today, that consistency is reflected in its value. A 1959 Oldsmobile Super 88 typically ranges between $30,000 and $65,000, depending on its condition and originality. Now let's move on to the 1959 Chrysler 300E. This car doesn't really fall into the surprising category because from the very beginning it was clearly built with performance in mind. In fact, if there was one car in 1959 designed to be fast, this was it. The 300E wasn't just another model. It belonged to Chrysler's exclusive Letter Series, a lineup where the brand pushed boundaries and experimented with performance in a serious way. These were still large cars, but with a clear purpose behind them, and that changes everything. Unlike other cars that ended up being quick almost by accident, the 300E was engineered for speed from the start. Its design reflects that intention. The lines are elegant but more restrained, with less exaggeration than many other cars from the same year. There's less focus on visual drama and more on purpose. Even before looking under the hood, you can sense that this car means business, and once you do look under the hood, it becomes even clearer. The 413 V8 engine produced around 380 horsepower, one of the most serious setups of its time. This wasn't just about power, it was about intention. The car didn't try to hide what it could do. When you accelerated, you felt it immediately. Compared to other 1959 cars, the difference was obvious: faster, more direct, and much closer to true performance. That's what makes the 300E unique in this lineup. While most of the other cars rely on the contrast between how they look and how they perform, this one simply delivers exactly what it promises. There's also an important piece of history here. Chrysler's letter series cars quietly became some of the fastest cars in the world at the time, without massive marketing or widespread attention. The 300E is a key part of that legacy. Performance-wise, it could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 7 seconds, putting it clearly ahead of many of its competitors. At that point, it's no longer a surprise, it's dominance. That reputation still holds today. A 1959 Chrysler 300E typically ranges between $70,000 and $150,000, depending on condition and originality. Finally, let's talk about the 1959 Mercury Park Lane. At first glance, this doesn't seem like a car that belongs in this conversation, but it absolutely does. The Park Lane wasn't built to stand out in obvious ways. It didn't have the spotlight of Cadillac, the aggressive edge of Pontiac, or the performance reputation of Chrysler. Instead, it took a different path, more refined, more elegant, and almost understated. And that's exactly what makes it interesting. When you look at it, the first thing you notice is balance. It's still large, like most cars of the time, but the proportions feel more controlled. The lines are cleaner, less exaggerated, almost as if Mercury intentionally chose to go against the trends of 1959. That immediately changes how you perceive it. It doesn't look fast, and it doesn't try to. But that's where the surprise begins. Under the hood, the 430 V8 gives it a completely different character. It may not have been the most talked about engine of the era, but it was one of the most capable in its class. This wasn't a car built for one standout moment. It was designed to perform consistently well, especially on the highway. At higher speeds, its size actually became an advantage, making it feel more stable, more planted, and more composed than you might expect. And that's where the real contrast lies. The Park Lane doesn't impress through aggression. It impresses through how well everything comes together. On the surface, it feels like quiet luxury. But underneath, it has the capability to keep up without any trouble. There's also an interesting context behind it. At the time, Mercury was positioning itself as a more refined and balanced option within Ford's lineup, something that focused on comfort and composure without sacrificing performance. Mercury wasn't trying to be the cheapest option, and it wasn't aiming to be the most extreme either. Its goal was balance, and the Park Lane represents that perfectly. When you look at the performance numbers, it backs that up. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8 to 9 seconds, putting it right alongside more well-known competitors. It didn't make a lot of noise about it, but it was always capable. That same idea carries over into its value today. A 1959 Mercury Park Lane typically ranges between $25,000 and $55,000, depending on its condition and how well it's been preserved. Now let's move on to the 1959 Dodge Coronet D500. This is one of those cars that actually looked fast and still didn't get the recognition it deserved. It didn't have the reputation of a Chrysler 300, the visual drama of a Cadillac, or the popularity of an Impala. Because of that, it often flew under the radar. But Dodge was thinking differently at the time. It wasn't just building big cars, it was starting to focus on real performance, and the D500 reflects that shift. It's a more serious, more focused version of the standard model. From the outside, it still fits the 1959 style. Large, full of chrome, and commanding. But there's something about it that feels more controlled, more mechanical, and less about decoration. It almost feels like it was built with a different purpose in mind. And that becomes clear when you look under the hood. The 361 V8 in D500 specification came with specific upgrades that pushed it beyond the standard lineup. This wasn't just another engine, it was tuned and refined for better performance. The result was a car that delivered real capability. It didn't rely on surprise or contrast, it performed well because it was designed to. Compared to other cars of the time, it felt more direct, more consistent, and more focused. That's what defines its place here. The Coronet doesn't try to trick you, it simply doesn't get the attention it deserves. There's also an important historical detail. The D500 models were Dodge's early step into performance territory before the muscle car era fully arrived. Cars like this helped lay the groundwork for what would come later. In terms of performance, it could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 8 seconds, placing it very close to the top of its class. It didn't exaggerate, but it definitely didn't fall behind either. Its current value reflects that same balance. A 1959 Dodge Coronet D500 typically ranges between $30,000 and $70,000 depending on condition and originality. When you step back and look at all these cars together, something interesting becomes clear. What first seems like a lineup of big, heavy, design-focused cars turns into something much more meaningful. Because 1959 wasn't just about bold styling, it was a turning point. It was a year when performance started to matter more, even in cars that weren't originally built for it. Now, I'm curious. Out of all the cars we've covered, which one surprised you the most? Which one would you never expect to be that fast? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy cars that completely challenge expectations, you should check out the next video, The Fastest Cars of 1958. That's where this whole shift really started to take shape, and once you see it, you'll understand why that year mattered so much.